Okay, folks, can I formally welcome everyone to the Social Development Committee this morning and remind ourselves that we are in session. Could I ask everybody in the room to switch off all their electronic devices because they do constantly interfere with the recording systems. Could I then just advise our own members then, just around the protocols around the use of their tablets and so on. Silent. Could I ask any members then to declare any interest relevant to the agenda today? If none to be declared, then fair enough. Could I just advise people that they would have received correspondence recently from the clerk, just reminding members that you do have to declare interests if any exist on agenda items, just to be a reminder.
I don't know I have any.
Oh, it's just relevant to the kind of agendas, you know. Okay. Apologies, we have an apology to record from Jim Allister. Are there any other apologies to record? No other apologies. Okay, so we move on from that. Then moving on to the draft minutes. The draft minutes for the meeting on the 26th of June. That's on page 7 of your pack, members. Are members content to endorse the minutes for accuracy? Agreed? Okay, thank you. No matters under chairperson's business. Moving on to matters arising, just some housekeeping in terms of FOI requests during their summer recess. You'll recall that normally committees would delegate authority to the chairperson, deputy chairperson to submit views on releasing or withholding information in any non-routine or contentious FOI requests during the summer recess period. This has been this has happened in this committee from certainly my start of this mandate. Are members content then that remains a position? Okay. Also that, as usual then, for certainly in this committee, that we would receive correspondence throughout the summer in 2 batches in July and August. Members content to receive that correspondence on that basis? Okay, thank you for that. Further matters arising, which is the evidence gathering for phase 3 of the committee inquiry. Just to say that you have a note there from the officials detailing the witnesses who will be requested to provide written and oral evidence as part of phase 3 of the committee inquiry, and this is at page 3 of the members' tabled items. People are content to note that. Okay, thank you for that. Moving on then to the next item on the agenda, which is item 5 of the independent review of work capability assessment, with a briefing now by Dr. Litchfield. And could I then formally invite Dr. Litchfield and Ms. Stephanie Harvey?
Chair, just before you do, just the previous issue about the inquiry. I left before completion of the committee's deliberations last week. Do we take any decision about what we would do publicly with the interim report? I know we had a long-standing discussion about what it would be and how it would be progressed, but do we take any decision about making it public?
The report.
The interim report. The decision to proceed with the interim report, to put it in for debate for September.
Well, we haven't finalised that, but we're going to deal with that today.
The decision, or the fact that it was on the media this morning? That's what I'm referring to.
Well, we didn't have on the agenda the fact that it was leaked for today, that's for sure. And I would have to say, I'm certainly the person speaking on behalf of this committee. I'm very angry that the report has been leaked. And obviously, we're not going to give any discussion around that in terms of detail or anything else. I'm just saying on behalf of this committee, I'm actually very, very angry about the fact that this committee report was leaked. It wasn't approved to be leaked.
Well, that's the point I was raising.
Oh no, I mean, well, a leak's a leak. A leak's an unauthorised, and I think it's a serious breach of the protocol. It's a breach of the integrity of the people involved in it, whoever's involved in it.
When we were discussing it, Chairman, I did make the point that anybody who thought any report that we were concluding was going to sit on the shelf unleaked for 2 months was naive. Even I didn't think somebody would say within hours they would leak it, but they did.
Well, I'm not in control of anybody who leaks it, and say I'm making it very clear, I'm very angry about it because the report hasn't finished, hasn't actually left us yet, so I'm actually I'm doubly concerned about that. I suppose there has been throughout the term of the Assembly, there's been some leaks of reports and documentation, which I think is reprehensible. There has been a lot of reports which have not been leaked until they were duly authorised. So it's not always the case that people act without integrity. Somebody has done in this case, I presume. I don't know where it came from. I know Mark Davenport spoke to me in the hall yesterday. It was clear to me that he had some knowledge of it. I could give him no comment on it at all, and I can assure people on that. What was quite clear to me with the comment, it wasn't a question he put to me, it was a remark he made in the presence of another journalist. So that it was quite clear to me that he was aware of some element of the report.
Well, Chairman, just...
I mean, in fact, the words he used to me yesterday was, you have a minority report in. That's his word to me, and I've never given a yes or no or anything else. I just said the committee will do its deliberations. So I'm very angry about it on behalf of this committee. I want to put that on the record. I think it just demonstrates a complete and utter lack of integrity on behalf of whoever was responsible for it.
Well, Chairman, it's just a pity we haven't got a full attendance today, but the sooner we get it into the chamber to debate the issues and get it dealt with and get people faced up with what the committee has been doing, how they've been doing, and how people have been operating within the committee, the better.
Well, I mean, we can discuss that when we'll come to that in the closed session later on today, and I mean, members will make that decision as you're aware. You can put that proposition to the committee later, and you might find considerable support for that as well. So anyway, so moving on then again to the review of the capability assessment. Could I formally then invite Dr. Litchfield and Stephanie Harvey, please? Okay, can I just again formally welcome both of you here this morning to the committee, and very much look forward to hearing your presentation, and you're aware that members will have a number of questions to address to yourselves, and again just to remind all of us that the department gave us their response last week to your findings, and it's just again to restate that this committee has had a long-standing keen interest in the work capability assessments and that whole process. So we're unanimously happen on the record of stating, identifying quite a number of concerns about the assessment process and the procedures around all of that. Particularly, I would have to say in regard to mental health issues, but not only that. So, and there are issues around where we've been advised that ATOS, for example, a different. In fact, I think I was told by the Social Security Agency at the beginning of this mandate there were two additional clauses in the contract here as opposed to what was happening elsewhere. But notwithstanding that, there still have been quite a number of criticisms of the process and need for appeals and the success rate of appeals and so on over a long period of time. So I'd be interested if you have any commentary on that, given that ATOS has abandoned the contract in Britain. So without any further ado, could I then formally invite yourself, Doctor and Stephanie, then just to present your briefings to the committee?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to come and speak to you today. As some of you will remember, I was here last year when I was conducting the fourth of the independent reviews. The requirement in legislation is to have 5 years of independent reviews of the work capability assessment, and my colleague Professor Malcolm Harrington conducted the reviews in years 1 to 3. I took on the mantle a year ago to do the year 4 review, which you've commented on the department's response, Chair, and I was invited again this year to conduct the year 5 review, which is the last of the reviews prescribed by statute. You may remember that last year I articulated some principles that I wanted to follow in carrying out the review. One of the most important of those was my firmly held belief, based on now quite a long career in the world of health and employment, is that the perception of justice is absolutely critical. that you can do things that are fair, but if people don't think they're fair, then that's what drives behaviours, and it's not a satisfactory position. And using the principles of organisational justice, there are really three key elements to that perception of fairness. One is distributive justice, in other words, who gets what, and that's clearly a decision for society to make as defined by our elected representatives. So I avoided looking at that because it's not part of my remit. But what I did look at were the other two elements of organisational justice, which are procedural justice, in other words, how the procedures are operated, and then interactional justice, which is the way that things are communicated. And what I found in Year 4, it'll be no surprise to you, is that what we have created here with the work capability assessment is an extremely complex system, which even somebody who is reasonably well educated, as I'm fortunate enough to be, has difficulty in understanding. Some of the language I found coming new to it is really quite impenetrable unless one is an expert in the field. And I felt that that complexity and that obscurity of language both contributed to a perception that the system was not as fair as it might be. And so in the Year 4 review, I made a number of recommendations about how the process might be simplified and also how communications might be improved and again made simpler. And the department back in Great Britain and indeed the department here have both accepted those recommendations in principle, and both are in the process of looking at how some of those recommendations can be implemented in practice. The other areas I really wanted to look at closely last year were mental health, and that's for two reasons really. One, that when one looks at the caseload of people coming through the work capability assessment, and as you say, Chair, there are some differences between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, but in both jurisdictions, mental health is the biggie. It's the major cause of people being assessed under this system. So because it is such a big issue, it struck me as something that I ought to look at. The other reason, which is a little more selfish, is that it's an area I've been interested in for almost 3 decades now, and therefore, selfishly, I thought I want to look at mental health because it's something I care about and maybe even have a little to offer in terms of providing recommendations. So you will have seen from the report that a significant part of it, and one discrete chapter, addresses issues around mental health. The other thing that struck me as I started getting into the Year 4 review was that there was something odd going on in terms of the work-related activity group. The numbers were changing quite significantly, and I didn't quite understand what was going on there. So in Year 4, I paid particular attention to the assessment that took people into the work-related activity group, and I made a number of comments there about the way that that system operated, and some recommendations about how things might be altered to, again, both make the system rather simpler, but also to, I hope, make it perceived as being fairer. Coming to the Year 5 review, some of those things I want to continue. I want to continue the focus on mental health because it remains, in fact, maybe even more now with the latest data, the biggest feature, the biggest proportion of the caseload coming through the assessment. But also this year, I want to look much more closely at the issue of people with learning difficulties, learning disabilities, going through the system. And that's because one of the things that struck me last year was that that group, which is in itself quite a sizable group, is a group which appears to struggle particularly in terms of dealing with this system. And as perhaps one of the more vulnerable groups in our society, it struck me that there might be some things that we could do there to improve the equity and improve the justice of the way that people feel that they're treated as they go through that system. The other thing I wanted to look at particularly this year, so I focused on the work-related activity group last year. This year I want to look very much in more detail at the support group, and rather as I did last year, looking at the way that people get into the work-related activity group and what that means. I want to look at how people get into the support group, how that's being applied, and getting into some of the technical detail of that. The approach I took last year, and it's the approach I've taken for very many years now, is I like to understand the process. I'm not an anorak when it comes to process diagrams, and there are plenty of those around. So I will look at process diagrams and look at policies, but what really does it for me is sitting with the people that are administering the system. So last year I spent quite a lot of time in disability benefit centres, and I'm doing the same again this year, sitting with the people on the ground who are actually administering the system and seeing how it works in practice, because it's not intentional, but sometimes there can be a disconnect between policy intent and practical applications. So I'm doing that again this year. And the other element to my approach is I like data. So it's an area where there is a lot of opinion, and in the past there hasn't always been the degree of robustness of data that I would like. And so I've encouraged the departments, both in Great Britain and here, to help me to produce data that would underpin the conclusions that I've drawn and will draw again this year, and the recommendations that flow from that. So in terms of Northern Ireland, as you know, it's a parallel process here in terms of the independent review. I was pleased last year to be able to come for various reasons. Malcolm wasn't able to do that, so I was particularly pleased to be able to come last year, and I'm pleased again to be able to come this year and to spend quality time with the officials in the department, with yourselves, with the Minister, and this afternoon with a number of people from the various stakeholder groups that have an interest in this area, to hear the practical experience of how the system is operating here in Northern Ireland. There are some differences here, and I drew those out in the Year 4 report. I think two of the key ones are that because of the size of the operation here, it is of essence a little less complex than it is back in Great Britain. So you don't have some of the challenges that they have to grapple with back in Great Britain, that they have simply because of the scale of the operation and the geographical disparity of the different areas. So, of course, there are differences within Northern Ireland itself, but the scale of it means that it's more manageable, and you can have informal relationships, informal forms of communication here that will work, that are much more difficult to apply in a much bigger operation. So that's an advantage that you have, and I think that is reflected in the differences between here and Great Britain. And my overall perception is that things here do operate, not saying they're perfect here by any means, I'm sure they're not, but my perception is that they do work a bit better here than they do in Great Britain. That may be little comfort to you, but it can be worse. The other advantage I think you have here is the way that you have set things up in the relationship with your healthcare provider, Atos, is that you have somebody within the department who is a health assessment professional, and she had only just started her work last year, and I made some recommendations about how the department might look to exploit that resource and that relationship better. And I've just spent some time today and yesterday looking at that, and I need to look at it in more detail, but I'm very pleased so far with what I've seen in terms of the progress that's been made in that area. I think it is a significant advantage that you do have, and I hope it's one that you choose to retain, maintain, and develop in the coming years. So I've probably said far too much already, Chair, so I'd be delighted to take any questions, queries, or give further explanations of anything that people would like to pick up on.
Okay, Paul, thank you for that. Just before I bring in other members, could I just ask, I think your recommendation 28, you speak about, this is regard to mental health issues and the department's need to have people with suitable and sufficient, I think the term used, previous experience of dealing with mental health issues. But I note that the department are saying further work needs to be done to work out what that really means. Now that gives me cause for concern, because at this stage of the game, and after, as I said earlier on, focus that this committee, for example, has had on this whole mental health issue and the process around that. So it just gives me a cause for concern that we're still having a report from the department saying they still want to tease this out. What's the tease out? I don't know. So would you have any comment on that?
I deliberately use the term suitable and sufficient, which my legal colleagues tell me is quite well understood in their world, to give the departments flexibility in terms of determining what is right, because what's right in Great Britain might be slightly different to what's right here in Northern Ireland. But in general terms, and I did try to give some guidance in the report, having had 35 years of medical practice now, and one continues to practice in the knowledge one will never be perfect, but in 35 years, I've seen a lot of people with mental health problems. And I have no doubt that that experience of seeing people with that type of issue helps me to put into much better context what they're telling me about the practical difficulties that they experience in day-to-day living, and indeed in terms of getting into employment. Now, the way that the contracts are written, one could come into this type of work having spent 25 years as a pathologist or 25 years as a midwife, where one may have had experience of dealing with mental health, people with mental health problems, but probably one hasn't. Now, there is training in place, and I made some recommendations about how that training could be enhanced and better documented. But not having that experience, I think, puts one at a significant disadvantage in dealing with people with those types of problems. Now, you can argue, well, that's true with any medical condition, but when mental health constitutes such a large proportion, it's a primary presenting condition, almost half of the people coming through the system. If one looks at comorbidities, where there are physical health problems and also mental health problems, which are very common, we're looking at 2/3 as a rough figure. So when it's such a large proportion, it strikes me that ensuring that people coming into this type of work have at least some suitable background in that area. If they're going to deal with those types of case, then it just makes sense to me. And the department in both jurisdictions are looking at what that means. I've had some discussions already with senior officials here about helping them to tease out what that might mean. And I've said I'm very happy to do that in terms of giving clarification about the types of thing that one might look for in terms of suitable and sufficient experience. What I didn't want to do in a published report was to be too prescriptive, because by doing that you can actually close off options. And so if I was imprecise, I apologise, but it was done with the best of intentions.
Well, it's not your imposition that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about at this stage of the game, the department are still saying they're not sure what sufficient and suitable experience actually is. That's what concerns me. Thank you, Brady.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. One of the things you've talked about is the complexity of the system, and you've also talked about the language used by civil servants. You didn't actually say gobbledygook, but you were saying they understand it, but it's very difficult for the ordinary person, supposed to understand it. In terms of the WCA, it is a complex system, and the system, we're told constantly by officials that the whole concept of welfare reform is not just to get people back into work, it's to simplify a very complex system, when in fact they've made it even more complex. And I suppose when we're talking about years, I've been in the benefit system 40 years this year, from both sides, from the departmental side and from the voluntary side. And if you go back to Fowler in '85, we were told that was going to make everything much simpler and easier to cope with. It hasn't. We have been to ATOS headquarters here in Belfast, 3 of us from the committee, not all of the committee were able to go that day. And we saw sort of a role play around mental health, and I have to say it was unimpressive as to how it was dealt with for someone presenting with mental health problems who had suicidal ideation and all of that, and had in fact tried to take their own life. Because when the work capability assessment was mooted in 2007, Fran and myself were on the committee then as well. We actually asked about what you're actually saying now about people having experience of mental health, how they would deal with it. And it wasn't addressed by the then Minister, and it really hasn't been addressed since. So in terms of the work capability assessment, ATOS have pulled out of it in Britain. The same people are doing it here, and I'm not sure that people are totally convinced that they're doing it any better here, there's any real difference, because it's the same company. And I suppose the blunt question, because you've analysed the whole system, you've talked to people now, do you think that it is fit for purpose? Because in Britain what's happening is there's a waiting list of claims coming through. It's going to take years, which is putting more and more pressure on the outworkings of the WCA, whoever may then take on the contract. So, you know, it is a fairly blunt question, but do you think it is fit for purpose?
Okay,
as it is now, as it stands at this particular moment in time?
If I could park that for a second and just address a point you made a wee bit earlier, which is linked to the Chair's point. So what I will be doing in this review is, of course, monitoring the progress that's been made in terms of actioning recommendations from previous reviews, including my own from last year. So one of the things I will be questioning departments on is what progress has been made with the provider at the moment in terms of ensuring that people do have the right sort of experience and indeed training in terms of dealing with people with mental health problems. It's not the easiest part of medicine to deal with, I think one has to acknowledge that, but nevertheless I will want to see what progress is made and will be challenging in terms of that questioning. In terms of whether the assessment is fit for purpose, that is the $64,000 question. It's also a very difficult question. So I gave that a lot of thought. I've tried to address it in the report. And one has to go back to the way that it was designed and indeed how its preceding assessment was defined and constructed. And that proved quite difficult with the churn of staff in DWP going back 15, 20 years to look at why things are the way they were. But eventually one found someone nearly as old as myself that I could get some answers out of. And when you analyse it, the way that the assessment was built was that it was essentially built around a threshold. So are you going to meet the criteria to move from Group A to Group B or not? Now, the way that's been built is to apply points. And the reason for that is particularly when you industrialise it, as they've had to do for Great Britain. If you want to get consistency across hundreds, perhaps thousands of healthcare professionals right the way across the country, you need some sort of really quite regimented system that allows you to ensure that consistency is applied. And the way they've done that, and it's a reasonable approach, is to use this points-based system. The problem with a points-based system is that I came into it, and I think if we went out there and asked 100 people, they'd probably say pretty much the same thing. If you have a points-based system, you assume that there is a relationship between all of those points, and most of us assume that that would be a linear relationship. In other words, if you score 18 points, you're twice as incapacitated as if you score 9 points. You're not. Now, there is a broad correlation. If you score a really high number of points and a really low number of points, then the chances of you being much more incapacitated, of course, are much higher. But there is no mathematical link between those numbers. And the problem with that is that people assume that the points themselves are of more importance than they really are. All the points are really important for is determining whether you're this side of the line or that side of the line. And I witnessed a number of examples where people, and this, when I say people, I mean staff, as well as individuals making claims, were getting very excited, spending a lot of time, a lot of resource, a lot of emotional effort in trying to argue whether it's 6 points or 9 points. And the reality is, it doesn't make any difference. So the points elements themselves, I think, can be a bit of distraction. So is the system, to come to your question, is the assessment fit for purpose? In terms of determining whether you're this side of the line or that side of the line, it's not bad. No test is perfect. The driving test isn't perfect. GCSEs aren't perfect. Cervical screening isn't perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect test. What you try to do is get the best fit. Is it a reasonable test? Yes, I believe it is a reasonable test. The question arises if you were to say, well, I don't think it is fit. It might be a reasonable test, but it's actually not good enough for what we need, and that's a political decision. What are you going to do instead? So my conclusion in the report was that it's okay, it's not brilliant, one needs to recognise its limitations, but for what it does, it's not bad. One of the things I will be addressing in Year 5 is encouraging the departments to think about 10 years ahead. Because if one is going to construct something which is significantly better than this, it's not something you can do overnight. It's not something you can do within the term of one parliament. Realistically, talking to academics, to get something which is really good, evidence-based, robustly tested, piloted, implemented, we're probably looking at 10 years. So if we're going to have something which is fit for society in the middle of the next decade, we need to start working on it now. And that's one of the things I'm going to give some attention to in the Year 5 report, because that is, of course, the last of the statutory reviews.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, the point system, and you do allude that in your report, that it's really the whether the person's capable or not. It's very difficult to explain to somebody that they've got 14 points and not 15. Because really it means they're almost there. You're quite unfit, but you're not really unfit enough. And if you look at the work-related activity group, that's actually a regressive step. That goes back to 30 years ago when they started to do appeals, where somebody wouldn't be found fit for their normal occupation, but could be found fit for later work. And in our area, that was usually a bingo caller. Now, when you rang the local job office and said, when's the last time you had a vacancy for a bingo caller, the job didn't exist. So you had this sort of nebulous, arbitrary kind of decision by a decision maker. Well, you can't, you were a brickie or a plumber, but you can't do that anymore, but you can become a bingo caller. Or a lift attendant, that was the other great one. Our nearest lift in Newry was 30 mile away in Lisburn, I think. And you might have to travel by bus. These ridiculous notions. And really, in a sense, nothing's changed in that when you take the work-related activity group, because they're saying, well, you're unfit at the moment, but we'll work you towards something. Now, they don't say what that something is, because the reality is there's nothing. You know, it's a kind of way of splitting it up. So, you know, the point system just doesn't work. And you're quite right, if somebody gets 18 points, it doesn't mean that they're twice as unfit as somebody with 9. It's just a ridiculous system, really. And the emphasis should be on that person's ability to do something, to do nothing in terms of employment. And I think therein lies the problem. But we go back to the mental health, and I just make the point. We were arguing back in 2007, for instance, if somebody presented for an interview with bipolar on a Monday, they could be on top of the world, they could climb Everest without oxygen, but on Tuesday they might be in bed for 3 weeks. And how does somebody actually assess that? So that's where the importance of proper and detailed medical evidence comes into it, and some sort of medical history, because it's impossible, and it's unfair as well, to expect a client advisor or somebody doing a work-focused interview to try and actually come to that kind of assessment in the space of 10 minutes. So there's a lot of flaws within that system. I think you've identified some of them, but I think you've been very diplomatic in your answer to my question whether you thought it was fit for purpose or not. So maybe we'll just leave it at that.
Well, thank you for what I'll take as a compliment.
Right, okay. Maybe an inverted one, but nevertheless. Thank you.
Well, now I'll call to be Duck 22, Michael Copeland, your next.
Thank you, Chair. And just to reiterate, and I agree with quite a lot of what Mickey has said. I remember my wife being discharged from the police as a result of an injury and receiving a letter telling her that she could find work as a cinema usherette on the day that the last cinema in Belfast closed, which wasn't terribly helpful. Thank you once again for coming along. And one of the things gets me attending a substantial number of appeals in connection with Employment Support Allowance. There's a number of occasions on which the acknowledged expert, the plus assessor, has adjudicated no points, and within a very short space of time there's 16, 18, or in one case 32 points. And I'm just wondering how any particular professional could arrive, unless it's as Mickey has said, at a decision that there is on paper absolutely nothing wrong or absolutely nothing to indicate the award of any points, and an appeal panel which is independent but which is comprised of experts in the fields of disability and medicine adjudicate totally differently. And I can't remember when it was, but I think we met your predecessor in one of the rooms downstairs, and I had asked, it was something from DWP, had any consideration being given to the unforeseen consequences of the applications of this legislation in its GB form in Northern Ireland, and he did undertake to determine whether or not any work had been done around unforeseen consequences and to write to us, but to the best of my knowledge, he never did. The mental health aspects which you are quite interested in fascinate me. They fascinate me for several reasons, because there are, in my understanding, several types, broadly speaking, two types of mental health conditions. Those which are there because they're there, be it chemical or an imbalance or a difficulty. And then there are those that are induced by trauma, which in many cases goes unaddressed. And in fairness, Northern Ireland has had a very difficult history, and a large number of people were exposed to situations that would not be the norm that would be expected in Nottingham or Birmingham, or Glasgow or Cardiff. And I'm just wondering, within the way in which people with, and I'm almost loath to use the word mental health problems where it's trauma based, is there any differential to try and determine symptoms that are often unseen? And are you sure that we are catching enough people who evidence the symptoms to make sure that the awards are right? Sorry, Chair.
So the assessment is founded on capability. So it's the impact that those symptoms have on day-to-day life, and therefore the ability to hold down employment, that the system is trying to assess. So there is a slight difference there. I think it comes back to this suitableness switch experience, because if you have experience of dealing with people with a range of mental health problems, then you take that into account when you're formulating your judgment, and you can put into context what people are telling you and work out from that what the likely impact is going to be on capability. So I think it reinforces the point about how that is absolutely critical. In terms of the difference between initial assessment and the resulted appeal, I suppose there are several elements to that. One is that, certainly talking yesterday to the President of the Appeals here, quite often that difference is down to additional evidence being brought in. Some of it is down to the way that the person appears on the day at the tribunal and the way that the person appears on the day at the assessment, which, particularly with fluctuating conditions, and mental health is one that does fluctuate quite often, can be quite different. There's also another element with, and you see it with both learning disabilities and mental health problems, a lot of people underplay the effect of their condition on their ability to cope and their capability. And that's something I'm giving more thought to this year. And I must say, it's perhaps a function of my protected upbringing, but someone said to me something the other day that I hadn't thought about before, that and it worries me. So you go for an assessment, you know you are getting psychotic symptoms. You don't want to say anything because they think they're going to take your kids away or they think they're going to section you. Now, of course, the way the system works is that's not going to happen, but I think we need to make sure that the system gets it absolutely clear to people that this is not part of what this is all about. Because if people are deliberately underplaying the effect on their lives because of worries about consequences that are totally different from the benefit system, then we can address that, and we should be addressing that. So I can understand why there are differences with the appeal system. There will also be cases, of course, because this is a system administered by human beings, where errors are made. And what one has in both Great Britain and here is a scheme of audit. And I was hearing only this morning about the way that you're applying audit here, which I think is good, is probably an improvement on some of the things that happen in Great Britain. But a lot of that is around helping the healthcare professionals to do a better job. And I don't think there are many healthcare professionals working in this system that are deliberately doing a bad job. I think where they do make mistakes, it's because of lack of knowledge or they're having a bad day or whatever. So having a robust feedback mechanism, I think, is very helpful in terms of driving up standards. And I know it's something the department here are working hard on to try and ensure that they do have that feedback loop so that the audit process drives up standards over time. So I hope that will address some of those issues, but it's not going to be a quick fix.
Okay, thank you. And I have a number of members to speak, so it's quite a number of people to speak in this particular section, so we'd ask people to be, I know it's very complex, I should try to be a little bit brief in terms of questions. Dolores?
Oh, thank you, Chair. I would really welcome your review. I think it's very helpful, and I certainly welcome the robust feedback mechanism. I think that will be useful both for those who represent people at the appeals and indeed for the applicant themselves. But would you agree that there's a need for a broader government education in terms of a cultural shift? People go along to these tribunals not wanting actually to, they want to win the appeal, in other words, to be deemed unfit to work. So, I mean, what recommendations really can you assist with that? And one other question, Chair, is just around learning disability. And I note that you had or your predecessor involved MenCap, etc. Are there any conditions at all that are ring-fenced to say that these people will not have to go through the annual assessment, because some of it is quite outrageous?
Yeah. So if I can deal with those points in order. So, well, let me deal with the second one first. So, in terms of learning disabilities, this is an area that worries me. It's partly because I think the way the system is constructed, particularly being so complex, it might systematically disadvantage that particularly vulnerable group. But you're also right. It's also something which is the assessment itself can appear very threatening, and particularly to the most vulnerable people in society. So I think we do need to do work there to determine, is a face-to-face assessment the best way to deal particularly with this group, and especially when we come up to reviews. And I made a recommendation last year about people at the most, not least because of evidence I heard when I was over here last year, people with the most severe brain conditions, to extend the period of review, which at the moment maxes out at 3 years. And I suggested that we should be looking at 5 years anyway for that group. Now, I understand the concept and the drive never to write anybody off, and I think that's right. On the other hand, I think one needs to be realistic that if somebody has a particularly severe learning difficulty or indeed any other condition which gives rise to significant incapacity, and you know that the chances, short of a miracle, are that it's not going to improve, then why are you pulling people forward on a regular basis for something which isn't going to add extra information and which will be perceived or could be perceived as very threatening for them. So that is, again, something I'll be looking at this year. And I will be making recommendations about that. I don't want to
No, that's fine.
say precisely what those will be yet, because I haven't formulated them in my own mind. So with the appeals, I'd like a situation where hardly any cases went to appeal, because you got it right first time, or we got it right first time. And I think that's what we should be aiming to achieve. Of course, when people reach that stage, then they do want, they're appealing for something because that's what they want. There's an element of education, I think, earlier on in the process about getting people to understand, because they don't always, and healthcare professionals can be a big barrier too, that work can be very good for you. And I think sometimes in my own profession that's not sufficiently well understood. But nevertheless, people are appealing because they want the benefit, and I don't think we can disregard that. And inevitably, they will try to present a case that gives them success in that.
Thank you.
Okay, Edwards, thank you. Gregory, now for a...
Yeah, you're right about the complexity of it. But I want to put, sort of try and keep it as generic as possible. On your forward, way back in December of last year, which I'm sure seems like some time ago by now, but you referred to the work capability assessment, and you said about it evolving, and there remain those who call for its abolition, but suggestions for what to replace it with are rarely forthcoming. Now, I suppose if I was looking for diplomacy, that's a very diplomatic way. It sounds like it's a diplomatic way of saying you haven't heard of anyone saying that there's a replacement, have you?
No. So one of the things that the department back in the UK worked on last year was an evidence-based review, which was not an alternative system, but a set of different descriptors to see if that gave a better outcome than the current system. Now, I'm still looking at that evidence-based review and the department's approach to that, and I will comment on that in detail in the Year 5 report. But in broad terms, if one accepts the department's view, then the alternative system, not alternative system, the alternative set of descriptors proposed didn't give an improved outcome. But that's a tweaking or a tailoring or an amendment to the current system. It's not a completely new system. But certainly in the United Kingdom, I haven't had anybody give me suggestions of an alternative system to this. One of the things I think we need to look at, if we're going to take this long-term view over 10 years, is whether we want a system that is based on capability or whether we want a system that's based on other things. If one looks at other parts of the world, you don't necessarily look at purely capability as the mechanism for determining eligibility for benefits. You may look at other things such as the employment market and disadvantage in the employment market. There are other ways of doing it. That is a major policy review. But in terms of pulling something off the shelf that Charity X has come up with and said, why don't you do it this way? Absolutely not. Not even in the broadest terms. So we have what we have. It's not brilliant. It's not bad. It does what it says pretty much. But if we're going to have something else, it's going to take a lot of work. It's, again, I say, it's not something we're going to be able to replace in 2 years with something simple.
Okay. In relation to what you talk about, specifically referencing Northern Ireland, you had said mental health appears to have an even higher profile than in Great Britain, and better access to mental function champions by decision makers is working well. Have you been able to establish the reason for the distinction? Why it's more particularly a problem in Northern Ireland than in the rest of the UK?
I think that's outside of my remit, but I think your colleagues have alluded to some of the issues in your recent history that have not been a feature of life in most of Great Britain, and undoubtedly, I'm sure that must have had an effect. In terms of the better access or the better use of mental health champions, and indeed the in-house health assessment advisor, I think part of that goes back to my earlier point about things being that bit smaller. A lot of people know each other, much more inclined to pick up the phone, and you often know who you're talking to when you pick up the phone here. And we have an interesting situation in Great Britain where there's been a policy decision to cite for mandatory reconsideration, which has been introduced there over the last 6 months or so, a policy decision to locate the people doing those reconsiderations at quite a distance from their client base. Now, and that introduces some complexities which you don't have. I mean, it's a relatively circumscribed geography. You've got relatively small number of people dealing with it. A lot of them know each other, and that all helps.
Yeah, I understand it's outside your remit in terms of the physical and mental complexities here that may be distinctive from the rest of the UK for various reasons. But I was thinking more in terms of the assessment processes and how we arrive at a conclusive analysis of how a person or a group of people are positioned in terms of return to work or capability. I'm really thinking about that assessment process here being distinct and different in some way from the rest of the UK. Have you been able to analyse that?
So, if one comes at it from the standpoint that this is an assessment of capability, functional capability, then the reason why you are not functionally capable becomes secondary. So the causes of, if one accepts the premise that the causes of mental health pathology here are rather different to other parts of the UK, that the mix of cases within the mental health umbrella are rather different here. The impact on capability is still going to be broadly similar. Now, the mix might be different, but there'll still be broadly similar range of mix. So arguing that there should be a different assessment purely for Northern Ireland, I think probably wouldn't hold water in terms of a rigorous academic evaluation.
Right, yeah, that's okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Fra.
Sure, and I'll be brief, as I usually say. In terms of the report that you've done, say what we have as your recommendations and what the departments, OSDWP or DSD, and there seems to be a number, one deferred, but a number of them accepted, depending on the outcome of scoping exercises. So that says to me that they're not accepted. And it's amazing when you look at this documentation that the play rewards round, just talking, and a lot of stuff is in and around the level of training that's required. And Mickey said earlier on, I think back in 2007 and 2008 when we were querying the level of training, what is the level of training expected for a decision maker or somebody that may be a nurse doing the assessments of somebody that has serious mental health problems?
Mm-hmm. So it's not for me to defend the departments. What I would say is that some of the recommendations here are need some working through in order to determine what the operational impact is going to be. So I don't feel it's unreasonable for departments to say, we understand what you're saying in terms of the principle, but we need to look at what that means in practice. And what I'll be doing in the Year 5 review is seeing what progress has been made in terms of doing that scoping exercise, undertaking that evaluation, and what progress they've been made. And I'll be publishing that as part of the Year 5 review. In terms of what type of training one should be giving healthcare professionals, it's, in terms of mental health, I think it's understanding the broad range of mental health conditions, about understanding one can't train people up to be psychiatrists. So it's giving people sufficient training so that there is a common level of understanding of what mental health conditions mean, what the likely impact is on people's ability, therefore, to do various things. And that's what the training should be achieving. There are multiple modules. I've looked at some of them, and they're okay. But like everything in life, they can be improved. And I think there are opportunities as the system evolves, as new providers are brought on, as the system here evolves, to improve that training and make sure that the people who are going through that training actually do get it. Because one of the things that I suggested in the report, which hasn't been happening so far, is that when the departments approve individual healthcare professionals, which they do, that they should see the results from that training. So if, say, the pass mark was 50%, if somebody is getting 51% after 5 attempts, I'd be a bit more reluctant to sign them up than if somebody got 98% on the first pass. So by looking at the detail of the assessments of that training, what it will allow the department to do is drive the providers into rising standards in terms of that knowledge.
I think one of the things that has never been explained to us, and we've asked on a number of occasions, is what the level of training there is available to people that would be called healthcare professionals, and that could widely range from a nurse through to whatever. And I think that the difficulty that we had, and Mickey spoke on it earlier on, that somebody may be bipolar. How are they trained to deal with that? You know, is it a 3-week course? Is it a 5-week course? Is it a number of modules that allows them doing? And I because a psychiatrist or psychologist are sitting down with people, it may take them years to determine or go through the state of the mental illness that may exist.
So it is modules. It is predominantly online learning. There are a range, and they are very focused on capability, rather than things like diagnosis of medical conditions or treatment, the other things that a psychiatrist and a psychologist would necessarily get involved in. So are they good enough? Everything can be improved. I think it's something which others can come and talk to you about. If you go and visit Atos again, I'm sure they would demonstrate them to you, and the department, I know, are looking at those.
And Vicky just passed a comment earlier on about the whole process, that people are being found fit for something that doesn't exist, and at the end of it, that's a job. And I think that's the important thing. But the question that Gregory asked about what, and yourself responded about what replaces it, you know, all we react to is the constituents coming to us with the serious problems that they faced going through. So it's not our jobs to tell people what should replace it. What we try to do is advise the serious flaws and problems that we see in it. So it needs professionals to work it out, and not lay people.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, agree with you.
Okay, thank you. Salma?
Okay, can I just on 2 areas? The percentage of VSA appeals which have been held as result of hearings has, I take it these are UK figures that we have in the report, or these specific Northern Ireland figures? It's on page 22 of the report.
On page 22, it will be Great Britain.
Okay. Would that be dissimilar to what is the case in Northern Ireland?
I haven't got the number on the top of my head, but just talking to the President yesterday, it's the same order of magnitude. It's similar.
And are you disturbed that nearly half of the cases which go to hearing are overturned at appeal?
It's too high. It's too high a number going to appeal and then being overturned, yeah.
I mean, in terms of, first of all, the resources which have to go in the appeal procedure, what it puts the individuals through, and all of the additional work and the time delay which this involves, it just strikes me that that is something where I don't even know whether training is likely to reduce that. There's been the upward drift, 50% increase since 2010. Now, there's got to be some reason behind that. You'd have thought that over that period of time, decision makers, etc., have become more experienced, not less experienced.
Okay.
And yet, the upward drift. Do you have any explanation for that upward drift?
So, in terms of Northern Ireland, what I'm told by the appeals service here is that the number of times that a decision is overturned because they feel that the original decision on the evidence available to the decision maker was incorrect is actually a very low percentage. I haven't got the number off my head, top of my head, but it's single figures. The great majority of cases overturned are overturned on the basis of additional evidence presented at the appeal, or what is termed compelling oral evidence. In other words, the way that the individual comes over on the day when they talk to the tribunal. So my review did not indicate that the problem was fundamentally one of decision makers making the wrong decision. It was more that when appeals take place, it's other factors being taken into account that cause them to be overturned. Now, that begs the question, and I know mandatory reconsideration hasn't been applied here yet, but if that additional evidence is introduced earlier in the process, and to my mind, ideally, it would be very early on at the initial assessment, then you wouldn't get to appeal at all, because you would be taking all the factors into account and you'd be hopefully arriving at the right decision most of the time.
And that was going to be my next question. Is this because people don't know what evidence is acceptable at the very start? Or is it because at the very start of the process, the rules only allow for very limited evidence to be received, but widen the evidence that can be received later on? And if that's the case, what's the justification for narrow evidence at one end of the process, wider evidence at the top end, and in between time you've had all of the expense, and the bureaucracy which is required to run the appeal system?
So I think it's a mixture of both, all of those. Trying to get better evidence earlier in the process is something that we have been looking at. I've made some recommendations about that, and the department in Great Britain is in talks with the British Medical Association about co-designing a new form for the provision of further medical evidence by GPs. And what we're looking at there is to try and get something that will meet the needs better, and that will be relatively easy for GPs to produce. Because what tends to happen at the appeal stage is that people come in to see their GPs to get additional evidence. They are understandably very stressed. They are working to a tight time scale, and that puts a lot of pressure on everybody within the system. So avoiding that is good for everybody. That means getting better evidence earlier in the process. And also, which I recommend in the report, and which has been implemented initially here, is not altering that initial request for information to make it absolutely clear that you don't always need GP evidence, particularly with mental health cases. The people that understand the impact of your condition on your day-to-day living often isn't your GP. It might well be a community psychiatric nurse, a support worker, a family member. All of those people are legitimate sources of evidence, and encouraging the provision of that sort of evidence early on in the process, I think, would avoid the high number of appeals being made, and that's got to be good for everybody.
That brings me to the next question, because you answered it gradually. You had pointed out, and I accept the point you made, that nobody's come forward with a different system. So we have a system which currently is based on points, which is based on the evidence which is provided by professionals. is the danger with your recommendation 28 and also your the points you've just made that, you know, you should maybe be seeking evidence from carers, etc. The recommendation 28 was that less emphasis should be placed on the scores, and there should be really just to determine whether the threshold, etc. Does that plus widening the net of people who can give or provide evidence, such as carers, not all of whom are family members who know the person's condition, not all of whom are going to be totally objective in all of this. Does this increase even more subjectivity into a regime? I mean, again, I suppose I'm being guilty of what everybody else has been saying. You know, it's easy to knock the thing down, but you know, how do you get a system which works better? But my own view on this, and certainly from speaking to people, where they feel that there's subjectivity and it's a very pragmatic decision and everything else, that sometimes causes more angst because people feel they haven't been fairly dealt with. At least points, only evidence from professionals, hopefully gives a degree of objectivity to the system. Are you not in danger of moving to quite a subjective system with some of the recommendations you're making?
I would hope there's a balance. So I think when you get evidence in the round, then you tend to get a better decision. Purely what we call objective evidence is often subjective anyway, particularly when you're looking at things like mental health problems. If it's a broken leg, and somebody has difficulty in walking and moving their knee or whatever, you can do measurements. You can work out what that means in terms of functional capability quite precisely. When it's somebody who's significantly depressed or has a severe anxiety state or PTSD or whatever it might be, there's a large element of subjectivity in that assessment anyway. And the difficulty there is that you're seeing somebody at one point in time, and if it is a fluctuating condition, you may miss what's going on, and that could be either way. You might underestimate or you might overestimate the impact on their capabilities. So having evidence from people who see that individual on a more regular basis adds to the mix. So I'm not saying take away the objective evidence. What I'm saying is let's see if we can get evidence from a range of sources without turning this into something which is a bureaucratic nightmare. So it's a balance all the time between what's practical and what's going to give the best result. And that's hard. If it was easy, I don't think it would be where we are.
And the last question was, in your review, were you able to dig down to see whether there are huge discrepancies between individual decision makers, some being really hard, some being fairly easy? I don't do as many tribunals now as I used to do, but especially when it came to tribunals, you walked in and you saw who the chairman was. You thought, I haven't a chance. Other times you walked in and said, thank goodness I've got this one today. I really do think that there were those huge variations. In your review, did you notice a great deal of variation between either different tribunal chairmen, different decision makers, and what recommendations, apart from the training, have you made to try and deal with such discrepancies?
Looking at the tribunals is outside the scope of the review. So what I looked at was decision makers' decisions and recommendations from healthcare professionals. Now, both are subject to quality measures, which include a review of, at individual level, the advice that is given or the decisions that are made on a regular basis. And if people are outside of the norm, then the procedures that are in place, both within the department and within the healthcare provider, ensure that those are flagged up, and then people look at, so why is that? Is it perhaps that you've had a particularly skewed caseload in that month? Is it, maybe you have had a bad month, and we all have those. So what is it? And when there are problems like that, that training is available to remedy that. So yes, I did look at that. I'm comfortable that those procedures are in place. Does that mean that occasionally things won't go wrong? No, of course not. But the tribunal side is not within my remit to comment on.
I mean, just to kind of underscore some of those comments from Sammy, I mean, the committee, I said early on, has had a big focus on this issue, and even with the introduction of pre-decision phone calls from decision makers to claimants, there still is a persistently high level of decision being overturned on appeal. There's a flaw in the system, and this committee has drawn attention to that repeatedly, and we still don't have a clear answer as to why the process is not being fixed. So just saying, obviously this committee will return to this and retain a focus on that. Mickey Beattie, you're looking at for a final
just
comment.
a few points. I think we would accept that healthcare professionals don't go out to do a bad job, but they are working within very narrow parameters in terms of our capability assessment. And a cynical person might think that there were certain outcomes expected, and they work off a particular computer-generated form, and it's a tick box exercise. So in terms of assessment and examination, it doesn't really happen in the normal sense. There's anecdotal evidence of, I had one case where a fella had broken his foot very badly, and Musgrave Park were treating him. They gave him what's commonly called a moon boot, so as he could actually take the pressure off his foot but put it on the ground. When he went to the work capability assessment, the nurse who was doing it didn't know what a moon boot was. He had to explain to her its purpose, etc. So, there's inherent flaws there. Obviously, you mentioned about Mr. McLean saying about the amount of additional evidence that's provided. Yet I have again anecdotal evidence of many cases where evidence has been presented to the healthcare profession on the day and they have refused to accept it. I've had people going with x-rays and the person who was doing the assessment didn't feel capable of commenting on them. So there are issues like that. I just finished, when I started doing appeals a long time ago, mental health cases were actually assessed by a psychiatrist who was appointed by Medical Support Services, which seems a sensible way because he would have had experience of a wide range of mental health issues. So it's very difficult to argue against somebody who has that degree of experience and would actually tend to know what they were talking about. When somebody who's, with respect, a nurse who's probably doing a very good job, has a lot of experience, but doesn't necessarily have the complexities of mental health problems within their remit, So I think there are issues, but particularly about the primary medical evidence. I mean, if you look at DLA, if the department feels they don't have enough evidence, they can send to the GP for a factual report for which they get paid, so they're not particularly bothered about filling it in that sense, although it creates more work for them. There's no reason why that system couldn't be adopted and tailored to fit the work capability assessment issues. There are issues like that. You also mentioned mental health champions. The difficulty there, I think, is about, and Sammy mentioned it, about the objectivity of those people, because they're departmental appointments and work within that system, then their objectivity, I think, comes into question. So it's just maybe a couple of things.
I can understand that perception. I didn't find evidence of healthcare champions being, mental health champions being anything other than objective. In terms of the deciding how to progress, certainly, and it's even more evident here, the number of cases dealt with on scrutiny is higher than it has been in the past. So I think you can argue that in various ways, but looking on it in one way anyway, it does suggest that there's a bit more discretion being applied in terms of getting evidence in the most suitable way, and by requiring fewer people to go for a face-to-face assessment, it will undoubtedly reduce the amount of stress that those people feel. And one of the recommendations I make is about that initial triage and trying to make sure that it is applied consistently and robustly, so that you're only getting face-to-face assessments where it really is likely to add value.
I think Sammy's been very enforced in his experience of all these subjective chairpersons.
Okay. All right, okay. There's no other members indicating to speak. Paul, yourself or Stephanie, do you want to make any final comments? As I said earlier on, the committee has been focused on a number of these issues, particularly around mental health. So obviously that's something we will maintain a keen interest in the time ahead. Is there any other additional points that you might want to add? Or
Just say again, thank you very much for your input, which did influence my report last year. It will influence again my report this year. There will be a specific chapter related to Northern Ireland again this year. I will be reviewing the progress that's been made within Northern Ireland specifically when I publish the report. And my understanding is that the department are taking a number of things to their board at the back end of the summer. And I think that'll give us a good indication where we can reference evidence about the progress that has been made. So I'm optimistic about the way that things are progressing.
okay, Dr. Litchfield, thank you very much, Ms. Stephanie. Harvey, thank you very, very much again, and safe journey home.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, members, moving on then to the next item, which is the update on the Housing Repossession Task Force. Again, we have a departmental briefing this morning, so before we welcome then to this section Stephen Martin and Paul Grocott. Morning, Stephen. Morning, Paul. Can I just make a wee point? And I don't want to labour this, but we were asked to have this briefing, and we were asked to keep the paperwork confidential or restricted. I think is the term. Is that right? It was just drawn to my attention early this morning. Which I hadn't actually noticed it that way, but and then the thing's been trailed in the media, which is fine. I have no issue with that. But it's just, the committee's
Habit forming?
seems a bit of habit forming, all right. I was just curious as to why that happened. I don't even expect yourselves to address that. So just
Chair, if I could clarify, there was an embargoed press release put out, so it was embargoed until now, basically until we appear before the committee.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, you're very welcome. So again, just to remind ourselves that the committee again had a good focus on this issue and jointly worked with some of the key stakeholders to do a conference on this some time ago, and so we're very keen to hear a follow up on that. So,
Chairman, just to clarify
before we
that,
do-
does that mean restricted is simply it's embargoed until now, or does restricted have some other connotation?
No, it's embargoed until now, essentially in terms of public consumption.
Well, just on that, Chairman, does that mean then that, and I did see reference to it in the media, does that mean that whatever media source carried it breached the embargo then, if it was embargoed until 10:30 a.m. this morning?
well, I actually don't know who put it in the media, so I just presume it was the department. I didn't actually hear it. I only heard about it, so I didn't actually hear it.
In terms of embargo, my understanding is the media before the time at which it's embargoed, they can reference that there's a report coming out, but they can't actually reveal any of the contents of the report. That's my understanding. But
Okay, like I say, I didn't actually hear any actual reporting of it. I've just heard about the report to refer to. Okay, so again on a positive note, you're very welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to report to us.
thank you, Chair. As members know, the Minister set up the Housing Repossessions Task Force in February with a broad range of representation from across a number of sectors. I'm chairing the task force, and Paul has been the lead author of this first report. And this first report is essentially our initial findings on the scale of the problem and the nature of the problem. The task force, in terms of reference, indicated that report would be completed by the end of June, which has now been done. And following this, we'll move on to a solutions-focused report by December, which will bring forward recommendations for the Minister to consider in terms of any further actions. I think it's worth just flagging up that one of the things that we have found is that there are some critical gaps in the data that we have in terms of borrower and loan level information. A lot of that information is commercially sensitive, so banks haven't released it to us, and the Financial Conduct Authority, the regulator in London, has that information, but again has not released it to us. So what we have here is a good picture in terms of the evidence, but there's certainly more that needs to be done. And one of the things the task force has agreed is that we will continue to, until December, as well as working on recommendations, work to improve further the evidence that we have. Chair, with your permission, I'll just ask Paul, who's been the lead author in this, just to take the committee through the key findings.
Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, there was a presentation issued with the paper early on, so my presentation today just follow the slides, the structure of that presentation. So the paper initially outlines the unique context in Northern Ireland. While the cyclical characteristics of the housing market were familiar to many borrowers in GB, Northern Ireland hadn't previously experienced these trends, so the volatility of recent years represents a very different market to the one that had been previously in Northern Ireland. In 2007, prices in Northern Ireland were surpassed only in London, South East and the East of the UK. And at their height, house prices represent more than 9 times the median salary, and mortgage repayments consumed over 60% of incomes. The artificially inflated nature and unsustainable nature of the market has led to a crash which is unprecedented in its severity. The paper then moves on to try and work out the profile of distressed borrowers. And as Stephen referred to, we've encountered data limitations, so understanding the characteristics of those affected has been impacted by those data limitations. But the data that we do have shows that borrowers in distress were credit hungry during the period of relaxed credit conditions and have recently experienced an income shock or life-changing event. So groups that are likely to be affected are at the lower end of the income range at which home ownership is possible, are financially overstretched investors, those that have been made redundant or had their income reduced, individuals in fragile employment, such as the self-employed, households who have experienced relationship breakdowns, those lacking basic financial capability, and borrowers which have significant other debts. In addition to the profile and the characteristics of borrowers, we felt it was important to make the distinction between the type of loan, which is at the root of borrowers' problems. So we found that mortgage activity for house purchases began to decline after the crash, which reflected the affordability constraints of the market, and also served to protect many would-be borrowers from exposure to the adverse impacts of purchasing with low equity and highly geared loans. However, remortgaging failed to react to the unsustainable nature of the crisis, and remortgaging activity continued well until the cliff edge of the market in 2007. At the height of remortgaging activity, data shows that 3 in 4 transactions were used to raise extra funds to either consolidate debt, fund home improvements for lifestyle purchases, or to finance buy-to-let properties. Many of these profiles will be familiar, however, a number are unique to the current crash, and some are specific to Northern Ireland. So, for example, underemployment is a particular feature of this recession, and the popularity of equity release at the height of the crash is something quite specific to Northern Ireland. Something that we found that does sort of unite sort of borrowers in distress is the prevalence of negative equity in Northern Ireland. So the relaxed credit conditions, weak regulatory oversight and prevailing view that this time is different, with an environment of rising house prices, had led to a rise in the loan-to-value ratios. These high ratios in a period of high prices leaves borrowers with very low equity buffers should prices begin to fall, which, as we know, proceeded to happen with quite emphatic force. The severity of the fall in prices and sluggish recovery in Northern Ireland distinguishes the region from all other parts of the UK. Further to the prevalence of negative equity, which is estimated to be at 41% for mortgages advanced since 2005, the average value is also significantly higher, so at £35,000, the mean negative equity held by homeowners in Northern Ireland is double that of the UK average. Which leads us on to this, the notion of mortgage prisoners within Northern Ireland. So many borrowers in negative equity are unable to improve their position by remortgaging for a better deal or possibly moving house. This category also includes those on interest-only loans, those with poor credit histories, or those in fragile employment. It's estimated that around 60% of borrowers in Northern Ireland could be mortgage prisoners. Now, while this will have, or may have no impact on households who are happy with their current position and can manage their repayments, the prevalence of mortgage prisoners can stifle upward mobility and sustain a dysfunctional market environment. Moreover, households classed as mortgage prisoners are at a heightened risk should they encounter pressures on their ability to pay. Within the crisis, we found that over-indebtedness is the most significant negative impact on borrowers' ability to pay. But many households which accumulated large amounts of debt have been unable to withstand the strong and persistent economic headwinds of this recession. The vulnerability of households ability to pay within Northern Ireland is illustrated by the median gross weekly earnings continuing to lag behind the UK average. Similarly, the Northern Ireland households have the smallest amount to save or spend because disposable income is lower here than it is in the UK, and also the number of households with no savings at all is significantly greater here than in the UK. So over-indebted groups, unsupported by wage growth, pressurised by inflation and holding little and no savings, are highly exposed to interest rate rises, income and expenditure shocks and changes to credit conditions. A good indicator of how exposed these groups are is the proportion of highly geared borrowers. So around 50% of borrowers in Northern Ireland currently spend more than a third of their income on mortgage repayments. This is expected to grow to over a quarter if interest rates rise, in line with the Office of Budget Responsibility expectations. While the proportion of borrowers affected by this rise will continue to be largest in the lower income scales, we expect that the range of borrowers affected will climb the income scales. Because of these pressures on ability to pay, we found there are higher levels of arrears in Northern Ireland than in other UK regions. And in particular, there's a large group of borrowers that are in a long-term unsustainable debt position. The large debt overhang and proportion of borrowers in this long-term unsustainable position poses a risk to strong, sustained and balanced economic expansion, because the prevalence of arrears and levels of negative equity can inhibit the ability of consumers to support growth and may undermine economic recovery. Moving from the arrears issue naturally progresses to the level of possessions within Northern Ireland. The prevalence of negative equity and repayment arrears, we found, has created the conditions for what might be described as a perfect storm. But despite these levels of possessions are lower than might be expected, while there's no single rationale for this, we believe that a combination of factors are at play. So lenders operating forbearance policies and often unwilling to realise the value of their losses, access to good quality advice, including the Mortgage Debt Advice Service, which is funded by the department, and a different attitude towards evictions. While this problem of possessions is relatively contained, the picture in the medium term may worsen. Within this context, it's important to recognise that a comprehensive range of services are in place if households are worried about their situation. The evidence consistently shows that the earlier borrowers receive advice and engage with their lender, the more likely they are to arrive at an affordable and sustainable solution. But it's never too late to start this process.
So where we're going from here is, because there have been data gaps, we're very keen to engage with borrowers who are in distress to get that qualitative picture to enhance what the task force has done. We've done a little bit of that through housing rights, but I think, as Paul alluded to, there are a high number of people who are in difficulty, who don't turn up at court and are overwhelmed by the problem, so that it's difficult to identify and engage with those people. So as part of the publicity for today, we're looking for borrowers to share their experiences, and we've got a fairly simple survey tool that we're putting out, and we're doing some communication around that. But we believe that the report so far gives us, as a task force, a good platform to move on to the next stage. We're planning for a range of stakeholder engagements in the autumn with those who have an influence on the system, so with lenders, with advice agencies, with borrowers, and across government organisations who provide the safety net, to try and work out the kind of solutions that we will need to consider in the task force, with a view to moving to a final report in December. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Stephen. Paul, thank you very much for that. Could I just ask, I mean, in terms of the next steps, and I think it is important, again, I think on behalf of the committee, to welcome the fact and acknowledge that the support the department is giving to, like, for example, the work around advising people and helping people with their rights around repossession and so on. I think that's very, very important to, again, acknowledge that. But is there not a case of a need to expedite the next steps in a way, because you already have a picture? You may not get a much fuller picture, although I think it's important perhaps to validate your understanding all right. But when you talk about future shocks, and for future shocks, that means, as you have outlined, repossessions, maybe the shorter to medium term, maybe more problematic for people. Given the comments from Mark Carney recently around the interest rates will go up sooner rather than later, begin probably, I don't know how soon, but I would have thought early this autumn would be the first increase. Maybe wrong on that, but so would that not again then argue for an earlier expectation of whatever conclusions might come, but the mitigating measures may be needed to be taken.
Chair, I mean, basically there are four things that, as a task force, we've agreed we're going to be looking at fairly quickly. I mean, the first is, and critically, improving awareness of the support that is available, because what we have found, and Housing Rights and others tell us, is that the earlier borrowers in distress engage with Housing Rights Service and engage with a lender, the more likely they are to find a solution that meets their needs. So part of today, and our key message from today, is to make sure that borrowers in distress are aware of what's available for them now. I think that's critical. Secondly, we need to continue to improve our understanding and make sure that we've got better data for future, so that policy making on an ongoing basis is better informed. We're also looking at, and fairly quickly, looking at the existing safety nets that there are there in terms of the supports, homelessness legislation, support for mortgage interest, all of the things that are there to catch people when they get into difficulty. And we're looking fairly quickly at further improvements that need to be made. And so the agencies that have a role there are represented on the task force. And finally, we're considering other options for supporting distressed borrowers to deal with debt. So while there's some further work to do on some of those things, I mean, a lot of today is about making sure that people are aware of the support that is available, because that's critical to a successful outcome.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Steve. Stuart?
Thank you, Chair. I have, like many members around the table, a particular interest in this, in that constituents have been coming to me on the issue of negative equity, and I'm particularly interested to note the fact that Carrickfergus is highlighted in the report as a hot spot for repossessions, and that's an area which probably is one of the reasons why, in my instance, and perhaps others, people have been coming to us. I hear you say that there is advice and support out there, and there is, but my experience of that is that many people will have gone through the steps that are recommended to them, but they don't actually get them anywhere. And to describe, for example, one scenario that I have had where a couple have come to me, they are in severe negative equity, both working in the public sector, but because of no pay increases and indeed reduced opportunities for overtime, they've both had to take on second jobs. In addition to that, they have made a decision at this point in time they cannot have a family because they have to pay their mortgage. And the alternatives, and therefore they do have the income and the resource to pay the mortgage, but the alternatives for them are that if they give up their property, they will their belief is they will find it extremely difficult ever to get a future mortgage, and therefore ever to be a property owner again. And the personal value to them of being a property owner is key to their lifestyle and what they want to do and how they want to have a family. And those are the areas of distress. I think the other area that has come to me, again through constituents, is what I would describe as some very dodgy organisations out there that ostensibly offer cheap solutions to get out of the problem of this indebtedness. And again, I think we need to be looking very carefully to see how those organisations and those companies are actually regulated in terms of the services which they deliver. Those are two issues which I have had to specifically deal with. There have been others. So can I welcome the opportunity that you're now going to do a survey and that you're going to gather more data, because I know on the basis of just a small piece which I did on the radio that I got a substantial number of inquiries from right across Northern Ireland on the subject of negative equity. It is a very serious issue. It causes immense personal distress for those people who are in that situation. And you can go through all the arguments that maybe they put themselves there, they were perhaps greedy in terms of their desire to move house and to get a bigger and better house. But that's where society was driving people. And let's face the facts, that's where the banks were encouraging people to be. I'm not particularly a bank basher, but I think the banks, we have a responsibility in terms of that as a society. So there's a great deal of stress and distress out there in relation to this issue. I don't know what the final solution to it is. A lot of it is around the areas of advice. It also seems to me, and just coming back, Chair, with your giving just one final point in respect of this, while what might be described as normal lenders, building societies and banks are by and large willing to work with and cooperate with. It seems to me that there are some other financial institutions and bodies out there on the edges of the banks and building societies, people who were giving top-up money, people who were providing internet loans, and perhaps organisations that are outside Northern Ireland but are in the rest of the United Kingdom. It seems to me that they are much less willing to be cooperative with clients who get into very difficult situations. I don't know whether those experiences that you have, but I think it's important that the survey gets out there and that we get a much better picture of what's actually going on.
Okay. Chair, if I can respond on those points in reverse order. I mean, I think the facts speak for themselves. If you look at the repossessions hearings in court, a lot of them are taken by quite aggressive second charge lenders in English-based second charge lenders. By and large, the larger lenders and the locally based lenders have operated a more flexible set of policies and have been much more willing to exercise lender forbearance. So there are real issues there, and there's certainly that has been a feature of this problem. In terms of the kind of the organisations who might be offering wrong advice and misleading people, I think we would, as a task force, would be quite keen to hear about those and to share that information with Trading Standards, because if there are issues around mis-selling of services, those are obviously a key concern. On the very first point about mortgage prisoners, one of the things that we do want to talk to lenders about is an idea of mortgage porting. Now, they won't be keen on it, but I think mortgage porting is where a borrower has negative equity in their property, but they need to move. Yeah. For example, for work or for family reasons. They maybe bought a 2-bedroom flat when they were a young couple. They now have 2 or 3 children. They can't move without some flexibility from the lender. So mortgage porting is where they can take their negative equity and put it into their new loan. Mm-hmm. It's something the banks have been quite reluctant to do, but it's something that we are going to be discussing with them when we meet them again in the early part of the autumn, because it is an idea that I think needs to be fully explored.
Chair, can I just, well, that final point of mortgage porting, one locally based building society is willing to do that, and very honourably willing to do that, and very genuinely interested in delivering that. But the problem, and that's good, but the problem is for those borrowers who have multiple loans. It's extremely difficult. It's easier to port negative equity if it is with Bank A, Building Society B is willing to let you do that. But if you have multiple loans, then that is extremely difficult, and I think that's an area that needs serious examination, because actually mortgage porting is probably going to be one for that group of people has the potential to be a major solution for the medium term.
Just to, the paper adds that this it's an over indebtedness issue. It's not necessarily people struggling with a mortgage, as you make the point. That
they make the payments.
Yeah, there's large amounts of debts that people have accumulated, and that's what makes the issue so complicated. Yes. In many ways.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Fra.
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. I say that a lot of the information had been out there, but when it hits you in one report and you start to go through it, you start to really understand the serious difficulties that are out there. And like Stuart, I think every case tells a different story and probably requires a different solution to what you're doing. And Stuart raised the whole thing about the difficulties there were for people, and especially encouragements. And I think if you look through some of the regional newspapers and local newspapers, you will see advertised people who offer different types of advice, whether it's mortgage advice, and that people in severe difficulty are paying through the nose for poor advice now. And I think back to 2007, 2008, another minister had carried out a consultation that offered so much but delivered so little in terms of, and I think during that period, that's when the whole realisation of the mess that we're in was coming through. But I think probably what the biggest thing came out of it is at an early stage, yes, good professional debt advice can help people. And I think that's where we have fell down, and I is that when we have looked at this, we say, well, we'll give another 50,000 to the advice services and let them deal with it. And that's only partially dealing with the problem, because a big lot of the main advice service are Belfast based, and there is a need for satellite the advice out in different towns and villages or wherever. And I remember Housing Rights actually putting together what they called their hub, that would have allowed them to get to the people and go in and offer advice, offer the information, but it would have required substantial investment. I think at that time they were talking about $500,000, but in the broad scheme of things it wasn't a big lot of money. And I think it still could play a vital part of it. I think the important thing, and I think that's one of the organisations, I know you probably have been talking to them, but that's certainly one of the organisations that have already been working with the court system and have provided good, effective representation, but they would still tell you that they only deal with a small amount of people in comparison, because most people give up the ghost and say, well, what's the use, let's just walk away when they're convicting. So I think there needs to be still a heavy investment in a particular type of advice, a particular type of service to encourage people. And I think the crucial thing that Alec raised, and you get murmurs at, is the possibility of an increase in interest rates, because the figures that you have there could seriously increase with an increase in interest rates. I think that people say, well, we'll never fall into that trap again, but the trap has already been set again in terms of house price increases, the availability of mortgages and availability. And we need to learn that lesson and trying to work out a mechanism that allows us to effectively think. I know it's not an easy solution, but we need to come up with some answers for very difficult questions.
If we just come back on maybe on the advice services, we currently, Housing Rights are part of the task force, and we currently fund them to the tune of about £1 million through the department to both their mainstream advice and their mortgage debt advice, and Debt Action, which has offices across Northern Ireland, is funded by DTI to the tune of about £1 million. So there is a local network that then can feed into Housing Rights. I think this question of whether we need to look at changing that service is a good one. We'll be retendering for a mortgage debt advice service early next year, so there's an opportunity for the task force to influence the shape of that tender and to look at the services that will be provided going forward. And we'll take on board your points.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks for that, Sammy.
Yeah. At the beginning of the report, you talk about low and negative equity. That's 41% for low and negative equity. What's the actual? Do you have the breakdown between people who are in negative equity? Because low equity probably you can live with. Mm-hmm. Negative equity you can't. What's the breakdown there?
No, well, that information is drawn from a piece of research that the BBC commissioned through HML. The actual breakdown of negative equity within that bracket isn't provided in that, and it relates to the problems that we've been having earlier about getting the borrower and loan level information. Until you get that loan level information, which changes and fluctuates as the market changes, and as people repay their mortgage, it constantly evolves. So it's quite difficult to get a snapshot at a particular period and then monitor how that changes without access to the regulatory information.
Right, because obviously that distinction is quite important though, because mortgage prisoners become less likely if there's some equity in the house, whereas and if it is a BBC figure, you can be absolutely sure they've tried to ensure that it's the worst possible figure. And I think we've got to be careful, don't actually create alarm in the housing market as well with some of this stuff, because confidence is quite an issue. The second one, it was just, and it's touched by the chairman already, I suppose, but given that we have a number of, there's still a fair number of people who are in the process. In fact, in Northern Ireland, if you look at the table on page 29, I don't think I remember the table, just under or above paragraph 71, there is a big overhanging problem if you look at that particular figure there. while repossessions have been lower than what one would expect. If you look at possession orders and live possession cases, I mean, there's a huge problem sitting there, which could be triggered by wage rises or further down, if there's a downturn in the economy or whatever. Why then do we need, because I think that we need to move quickly to solutions rather than more information. Surely we have enough information here to say there's a problem that has to be dealt with. Is there any way that the time scale, a report to the Minister by December, could mean that there's a lot of actions to be taken from that report? You know, we could be actually getting answers to the problems when the problems will be nearly halfway through on us. Is there any way that time scale can be shortened, or are there any current recommendations sitting with the Minister that can be dealt with even ahead of some of the other work you've got to do?
I think to answer that, Chair, because there are so many people involved, the lenders and a number of government agencies, it'll be difficult to bring things forward. But following today's session, we'll certainly look to see if there's anything that we can expedite, to do earlier. We're going to, Paul and I are going to engage with the arrears committee of the Council of Mortgage Lenders over in Bradford in September. And certainly there will be things that we'll want to pose to them at a fairly early stage in terms of the major lenders, if there are things that can be done. But we'll take away from this a message that the committee would like to see some earlier action. And certainly if there's anything that we can do before December, we'll look to do that.
And I mean, have there any solutions which have been put forward by housing associations? I know that there has been some discussion as to whether or not you could move from kind of mortgage to rent arrangements and whatnot, and some of the housing associations, like ownership and whatnot, would be capable of doing some of that kind of work. Those are major things that you don't really require, that you could enter into discussions with now. Has there been much discussion with other bodies of the government working with at present to see if there are immediate solutions?
There have been some discussions. The difficulty that ownership have is their lending, their agreements with their lenders are fairly tight, so they would have to go into a fairly protracted negotiation process with their lenders to do something like this. So it wouldn't necessarily be a quick solution. It's certainly something that's being discussed, but it's not something that would necessarily happen that quickly.
All I'm saying is that you've got to get the starting blocks first of all. That's what I'm saying. And if you put the starting blocks another 6 months, yards down the track, then you're slower in getting started. I mean, if the problem is as big as what it is, and I hope that the low equity is more prevalent than the negative equity. We don't have those figures, but if the problem is as big as what it is, we do know that the things which have caused this, people taking on a lot of debt, wages not going up, the likelihood of interest rates increasing in the near future, a big overhang of cases already in the system which will come to fruition sooner rather than later, then we really can't afford not to be looking at some solutions that even ahead of a nice tidy report that can go to the Minister for our action. If there are some things, ad hoc things that can be done, then I think we should be emphasizing or pursuing those.
Okay, thank you, Dolores. Now, Trevor.
Chair, I'll be brief, and thank you for the report. But like yourself and Sammy, I naively thought that the task force would be presenting solutions to the problems, because many of us know what the problems are. People borrowed money they didn't have and couldn't pay back and lost jobs. So when we see measures being taken that will help those most severely affected, and what lessons, if any, have you looked at in terms of GB and the Republic of Ireland in terms of how those governments responded to the crisis?
I mean, the task force, when we were established, our terms of reference were to produce an evidence-based report by now and a final report by December. So we're bang on the money in terms of that. In terms of the points about what we can learn from other jurisdictions, There have been some things tried in other places, such as the mortgage rescue schemes tried in England and Scotland and Wales. Those have all now closed because they weren't found to be particularly effective. Now, we obviously need to look at the reasons why they weren't effective and see if there's a different set of scenarios here. So we have the benefit of learning from those. But in a way, I think what the task force has found is we're at a key juncture. It's not too late, but we are at a key juncture. If interest rates rise, we need to be ready. We've taken on board the committee's comments that perhaps we need to be looking at things that we can pull forward, and if we can, we certainly will. And we will learn from other places. We're looking to have a solutions-focused event in October, which will bring together people from other places. And I know the committee's conference last year looked at a number of things. We will be looking at other things as well, and hopefully that will help to guide where we go. But certainly, if there's anything that we can do earlier, we will do it.
But just on that then, have you a commitment from the Department and the Minister and hopefully the Executive then that if there are readily available solutions, that there will be a firm commitment by the Executive to present them to the Assembly early in the autumn rather than wait to the end of the year?
I mean, we'll take away the point that members have made. I mean, I suppose it would. I mean, I suppose the key point is that there aren't, you know, vast pots of free money available in the system. So, you know, we will have to, whatever solutions, if there's a price tag attached, we'll need to consider those very carefully. So I think it's important to take account of those. But I mean, we'll take the point away around things that might be done earlier and consider them. But funding will be limited, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Trevor?
Yeah, maybe following on from Sammy's point, and I suppose even following on from all our presentations where Sammy's talking about, well, in terms of that, how that help could be shaped. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, and we've had the presentation in the past about the shortage of homes in terms of the social housing sector. Yeah. But many of the homes is actually negative equity, I presume, given, I mean, some of the cases I've seen in my own office, where you have social houses with people having mortgages or borrowing and value at that time maybe 140, 150,000. What's actually happening in those houses when they've been repossessed or going to auctions at 35,000? The bit that strikes me is that given there's a shortage, once those houses are repossessed, those individuals are looking to get back into the social housing sector. Why there's not something done with DSD in terms of the housing executive to actually try and take those houses back at that stage at a reasonable value? I mean, these houses are coming back onto the property markets at 35,000, which is actually causing another effect because it's actually making people very nervous in terms of what they own if they own the house next door. Yes. So in housing estates, you've seen houses peaking at 150, 160 and 170,000. There's people who've lost their jobs. Once the house is repossessed, they're forced to go back in the social house, which could be the one at the opposite end of the street. So why housing executives not come up with some sort of model actually to do a buyback with the people in situ and actually try and keep the tenant in that house and paying, I mean, if they come to some arrangement in terms of the value as well, I think would go some way as opposed to creating another effect in terms of bouncing those back onto the market, which is actually making all people very nervous in terms of values.
Yeah, in terms of one of the things we have found is that although you know, there are around 3,500 repossession cases going into the courts each year, only around 500 people are presenting as homeless to the housing executive because of mortgage default. So a lot of people are finding their own housing. But I think there is a point around how possessions could perhaps be prevented. The housing executive is looking at a housing option service more widely, and this could be a key element of such a. But buyback is, you know, is something that could be considered. But again, you know, there are complexities around it and in terms of the funding arrangements, but it's certainly something that will feed back. The housing executive are part of the task force, and it's something that can be put on the table.
There may be complexities, but I mean, we listened to, I can't remember the guy's name here, in terms of actually looking at some of these houses and buying in some terms of some developments, and I think they reckon in around the value of 60,000. But I mean, take it from me, Stephen, this stuff's going to the market at 35. Yep. The estate agents are full of this stuff. You actually, I mean, if you actually go on to some of the property sites, you can only pick which estate agents are actually dealing with the repossessed houses. And those are only making 35 and 40,000. They're looking for solutions in terms of social housing. And yet, no, whenever they did, whilst they couldn't complete on their project last year, they were talking about values in 60 and 65,000. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and I mean, you actually could keep people in the homes as opposed to them losing the homes, actually start to pay their rents towards the housing side.
Okay, Maggie Brady, briefly, and then Rob, briefly again.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Just in your report, you talk about November 2013, people who lose their usual source of income within 27 days become dependent state benefits. It had been 34 days. You talk about the proportion of borrowers at the fragile end don't have savings. There was an item on the radio yesterday in Britain, 64% of people have an ISA. Here, something like 34%. Yeah. You know, so because our disposable income, according to recent reports, is about a third of what it is in Britain, so that creates problems. But just in the benefit thing, because a lot of people bought their houses in the right to buy and end up in benefit and income support or income-based benefits, that they get help with the mortgage interest. But changes brought in 1985 mean that if you bought or got a second mortgage to refurbish your house or make it better, then you won't necessarily get help with that. You have to get through hoops, you have to produce receipts and all. That is an inherent problem for people because it's difficult, because they become unemployed through no fault of their own. Go on to a benefit system which will help them with the mortgage interest, the minimum, and there's a constant, if you like, they may have to make up the difference. They're making it out of benefit, which is subsistence level. Creates all sorts of problems for them. And just, you know, and you talked about different schemes to try and help people. I mean, in February 2008, the then Minister was talking about a mortgage relief scheme. Nothing ever happened. It wasn't even tried, so I don't know whether it was going to be successful or not. It disappeared off the scene. I never heard a word about it. You know, so none of those schemes were tried. But there is difficulty because if people do become unemployed and you say they become more dependent on benefit within a relatively short time because they don't have savings, then their ability to repay becomes lesser and lesser as time goes on. So the arrears just keep on building up, and therein lies a problem. And maybe that's something that needs to be addressed. I know it's in the wider sense, it's a benefit thing, but just how people are dealt with, because that information isn't readily available. People assume, oh, go on to benefit, they'll help you with my mortgage, they'll help you with the minimum, but they don't help you with the second loan that you got to do your plumbing or put in a central heating system and that kind of thing. And I think that creates huge problem, particularly with the right to buy scheme. It was mooted as a great scheme at the time. You're going to get your house for next to nothing, which was fine for a lot of people, but the problems of the future weren't actually factored into all of that.
Yeah, I was just going to, the paper recognises this idea of a scarring effect. So if you enter arrears and stay in arrears, it becomes increasingly less likely that you'll return to a performing borrower. So certainly there's a piece of work that we need to concentrate on how do you stop that deterioration. It's definitely something that we need to be looking at.
Thank you.
Ron McCann, last contributor.
Sure, and it's just on the back of what Trevor said. It's one of the things that, in terms of recommendations, that you're looking at is the mortgage to rent. Because I know that a number of cases I had dealt with, that even go back a number of years ago, that one of the difficulties that there was there, that if you buy a house, then you have to fulfil the requirements laid down under housing selection, which then stop people staying within their own homes.
I mean, that was one of the complications that I was indirectly referring to, really. The housing selection scheme means that assessment needs to be done on the basis of need. So there would be a difficulty if somebody didn't achieve a high number of points, whether the housing executive under their current scheme would be able to keep them in the home that they owned if they repurchased it, is an issue. So it's something, it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem on the face of it. So yeah, it is a very valid point.
We had kind of concluded that, and I was going to tell you and tell these men are waiting for a flight, but go ahead.
Just when it comes to the ultimate difficulty with this when the house is lost, is there any mechanism by which intentionality and unintentionality is taken into account when assessing an application under the housing selection scheme?
Under the homelessness legislation, I mean, there is, as you know, the intentionality element. I'm not totally au fait with the detail of how the housing executive does or doesn't assess it. I mean, what I can tell you is of the around 500 people who present as homeless because of mortgage default, every year around half of them are accepted as statutorily homeless. The reasons why the other half isn't, I wouldn't be able to comment, only the housing executive could comment, so I'm not quite sure how they apply the intentionality.
Okay, there's no other members indicating to speak, so maybe just a couple of remarks in terms of concluding this, because obviously you're saying about the next steps is to trying to get further information and so on, and that's important, but I think you got the clear message from the members that most members believe that, if not everybody probably believes there's probably sufficient data out there, certainly an understanding what the problems are, and I would presume myself it would be difficult to get some of the financial institutions to give you some of the more type of information that you're looking for, so you could maybe be whistling for that one for a long while. So really the purpose here of members would be to try to expedite this process as quickly as possible. We do very much appreciate that you're on target in terms of producing this report, but in terms of the next step, we're trying to worry, can we make sort of quick steps? And in terms of then the looking at what mitigating measures may be brought in, we've referred to a number of them, and I suppose what we're looking for here is in as early as at all possible examining what measures and recommendations can be brought forward. Some of the issues have been raised here, some or all may be viable or non-viable. You said you've looked at examples in other jurisdictions, some of which, if not all, I think you may have said, the different measures have been stopped. But I mean, there have been programmes around write-offs, write-downs, buybacks, mortgage to lend, rescheduling mortgages, portable mortgages, which you raised yourselves. Could we just urge that all of those are still on the table for consideration as to whether or not they're viable? That's obviously part of your research. You'll have to determine that and therefore make recommendations on the basis of your evidence. So is that fair enough? Can I comment?
Yes, absolutely.
Looking at all the resolutions or possible solutions on the table for serious consideration?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so thanks very much, Paul. Thank you very much for your report this morning. Good luck. Okay, members, we're moving on to the next item then, which was proposed supporting legislation. Item number 7, we have an SL1, Public Services Pensions. So information in regard to this is on page 167. This would be subject to negative resolution procedure by the Assembly. Proposed it will come into operation in April 2015. Can I just kind of, maybe we can try and run through these here without rushing them, of course, but are members content for that? I'm just presuming that members would have read these. So are members content that the SL1 Public Services Pension would be agreed? Members agree with that? Okay, members, thank you very much. Item 8 then, SR 182, this is child support fees on page 173. Would members be content that this statutory rule will be agreed? And if so, then I'll read that under motion in the record. That the Committee for Social Development has considered the statutory rule SR 182/2014, the child support fees regulation in Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report recommended confirmed by the Assembly. All agreed? Members, thank you for that. Item number 9 then is SR 183. This is the Pensions 2005 order. It's a commencement order, so members content then to note the commencement order. Okay, thank you for that. Number 10, which is SR 191, child support. This is ending liability in existing cases and transition to new calculations rules. This will be subject to confirmatory resolution procedure before the Assembly came into operation on the 30th of June. And members, be content for this SR to be made? If so, we'll read into the record. That the Committee for Social Development has considered the statutory rule SR 191/2014, the child support ending liability in existing cases and transition to new calculation rules, regulations, Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, recommends that it be confirmed by the Assembly. All agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you for that. Then item 11, SR 192, this is Job Seekers Allowance homeless claimants. Again, this would be subject to confirmatory resolution procedure, and it will come into operation on the 21st of July 2014. If members are content with the SR, then I'll read into the record. Okay, that the Committee for Social Development has considered the statutory rule SR 192/2014, the Job Seekers Allowance Homeless Claimants Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, recommends that it be confirmed by the Assembly. All agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. So the next item is SR 193, this is Child Support Modification, Consequential, Miscellaneous Amendments. This is again subject to then negative resolution procedure before the Assembly and came into operation on the 30th of June. Members content with this SR, I'll read into the motion. Okay, or into the record. Thank you. That the Committee for Social Development has considered the statutory rule SR 193/2014, the Child Support Modification, Consequential and Miscellaneous Amendments, Regulations Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report. No objections to the rule. All agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. So SR 194/2014, this is the Child Maintenance Commencement number 14 and transitional provisions order. Members content to note the commencement order? Okay, thank you. And SR 195, this is Pension Protection Fund rules. This is subject to negative resolution procedure and will come into operation on the 21st of July 2014. Members content with the reading into the record?
Right.
Okay, that the Committee for Social Development has considered the statutory rule SR 195/2014, the Pensions Protection Fund Entry Rules Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, has no objections to the rule. All agreed?
Right.
Thank you. Moving on to correspondence, members, then find correspondence on page 6 of your tabled items. Just draw attention to a couple of items. On page 241 of your members' pack, PPR letter. I just want to ask if the members content to forward this letter to the department to assist with the ECNI's investigation. Members content with that? Okay, thank you. On page 313 of your pack, members content to write to Helm Housing following up the request of this Residents Association?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. By saying the departments provided the committee with indicative timings of the introduction of bills into the Assembly, and that's on page 8 of your tabled items, and they have noted that some further proposals may emerge as the policy development process for social housing reform programme progresses and the review of asset management is completed. Okay, just to note that. Our members then content to note the correspondence as per the memo. Great, thank you very much. The forward work programme you find on page 324. Again, just to note that the forward work programme for after the summer recess has been originally, I suppose, populated with additional meetings for the committee's inquiry, and that a letter will be sent to the department this week. They asked that it be populated with any evidence section of the department, which is to bring forward, because a lot of outstanding work there as well. So members content then to note the forward work programme, the letter also to the department, taking further advice from themselves in relation to evidence sections. And I suppose to take note that once we come back in September, we will be revisiting the schedule for the committee anyway in light of that new information. Okay, members agree with that programme then on that basis. Item 17, any other business to deal with by members? No, there are none to be raised. Then the next item we're moving into the committee inquiry. Could I recommend then we suspend for 10 minutes just for a comfort break, and then we return immediately in closed session to complete the work of the inquiry. We're happy enough to just have a brief 10 minutes or so. Okay. Thank you very much.